Look at your hand. Go ahead, hold it up if you can, or simply imagine it hovering there in the darkness above you. Its familiar architecture of knuckle and vein, the slight curl of your fingers, the warmth radiating from your palm. That hand, that specific, singular, irreplaceable hand. It is, in this moment, the most ancient object you will ever touch. Somewhere in the architecture of your DNA, coiled invisibly inside every cell of that hand, there exists a record, not a metaphor, not a poetic approximation, a literal, biological record written in the language of adenine and thymine and cytosine and guanine, a four-letter alphabet that has been copying and recopying itself across 300,000 years of human breath and human fear and human hope. Your hand is a library, and tonight, we're going to read from one of its most extraordinary chapters. Welcome, wherever you are in the world. Right now, as you settle into whatever soft darkness surrounds you, there are people like you doing exactly the same thing. Someone in Tokyo is pulling a blanket over their shoulders as the city hums outside their window. Someone in London is watching the pale blue light of street lamps slide across their ceiling. Someone in Sao Paulo is listening to the distant sound of rain. Someone in Nairobi is feeling the last warmth of the day, finally, mercifully, exhale from the walls of their room. We are all here, together, gathered around what I like to think of as a global campfire, invisible, warm, spanning every time zone, united by the ancient human need to hear a story in the dark. And the story we're going to tell tonight is not a small one. It is, in fact, the story of the single greatest civilizational collapse in recorded human history. It is the story of a world so sophisticated, so interconnected, so astonishingly modern in its ambitions. Trade routes spanning thousands of miles, letters written between kings addressing each other as brothers, ships loaded with copper and tin and grain and purple dye crossing seas that had no names yet. And then, in the space of a single human lifetime, that entire world went dark. We're talking about 1177 BC. Or more precisely, we are talking about the decade surrounding that year, roughly 1200 to 1150 BC, when a cascade of catastrophes so severe, so interconnected, and still so mysterious that modern scholars genuinely argue about what caused it, dismantled every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Cypriots, the Ugaritians, the Assyrians, all of them staggering, most of them vanishing. Tonight, we're going to walk through that collapse together, slowly, without urgency. We're going to let the names and the kingdoms and the dates wash over you like the tide coming in at a beach. You don't need to catch every wave. You don't need to remember any of this. Let it just arrive. Let it settle around you like the ancient sediment it truly is. Because here's the thing I want you to hold on to, loosely, the way you might hold a warm stone. You survive this. Not you personally, not your conscious self, reading or listening tonight, but the chain of humans whose specific sequence of births and survivals and choices produced you. They were alive during this collapse, or they lived in its shadow, or they were shaped by the world that rose from its ashes. The Bronze Age collapse is not something that happened to other people in a faraway time. It is something that happened to your ancestors, and in the most literal genetic sense, it happened to you. So breathe, settle, let your body feel the weight and warmth of where it rests tonight. We have a long, slow, beautiful journey ahead of us. And it begins here with your hand, 3,200 years ago, under a sun that looked exactly the same as ours, burning over a world that was about to end. To understand a collapse, you must first understand the thing that collapsed. In the world of the late Bronze Age, the world that existed between roughly 1550 and 1200 BC, was not the simple, brutish, sword and sandal world that the popular imagination sometimes conjures. It was not a world of isolated city-states glaring at each other across empty wasteland. It was something far more remarkable, far more familiar, far more heartbreakingly recognizable. It was, in almost every meaningful sense, a globalized world. Imagine a web. Not a small web. Not the web of a single spider in a single corner, but a web of trade and diplomacy and cultural exchange that stretched from the tin mines of Afghanistan in the east, across Mesopotamia, along the Levantine coast, through Anatolia, across the Aegean Sea, into Greece, down into Egypt, and up again through Cyprus. A web that had been growing, slowly and deliberately, for 300 years. A web held together not by a single empire's military power, but by something far more fragile and far more extraordinary: mutual interest. Kings wrote letters to each other. Actual letters, pressed into clay tablets with reed styluses. The cuneiform impressions as crisp and deliberate as any email. The Egyptian pharaoh addressed the Hittite king as my brother. The king of Ugarit, a thriving port city on the coast of what is now Syria, maintained diplomatic correspondence with Al-Ashia, probably the island of Cyprus, requesting copper. Not demanding it, requesting it. There were protocols. There were pleasantries. There was something that looked astonishingly like international law. Copper came from Cyprus. Tin, the other essential ingredient of bronze, came from as far away as Afghanistan or the mines of Sardinia. Put them together in the right ratio, roughly 10 parts copper to 1 part tin, and you get bronze, the material that made civilization possible. Every sword, every plow, every hinge, every cooking pot depended on this supply chain. And that supply chain crossed thousands of miles of open sea and rugged terrain, maintained by merchants, ship captains, middlemen, and the occasional hostage held in comfortable diplomatic custody. Archaeology has been extraordinarily generous in illuminating this world. In 1982, a sponge diver off the coast of southern Turkey discovered the wreck of a ship that had gone down around 1300 BC near a place called Yalubran. When archaeologists excavated it, what they found was a perfect cross-section of this Bronze Age global economy. On board, 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, 1 ton of tin ingots, probably from Afghanistan, Canaanite amphoras filled with resin and glass and ebony, Mycenaean pottery, Egyptian gold, a Ugaritic merchant's personal cylinder seal, Baltic amber that had traveled from the shores of the North Sea. All of it on one ship, heading somewhere, when the sea swallowed it. That ship is a time capsule, and what it tells us is staggering. In 1300 BC, a merchant vessel was routinely carrying goods from at least 6 different modern countries, speaking at least 3 different languages, serving customers from a dozen different cultures. The interconnectedness was not incidental. It was the point. It was the system. It was the world. And within that world, people lived. Not abstractions. People. A scribe in Ugarit who spent his evenings learning multiple languages because trade required it. A copper smelter on Cyprus who worked beside a furnace hot enough to melt metal, whose hands were permanently stained with verdigris. A merchant's wife in Mycenae who sat with a clay tablet cataloging the contents of the palace storerooms. So many jars of oil, so many measures of grain, so many fleeces, each one counted and recorded with meticulous care. A sailor who had memorized the stars above the Mediterranean so precisely that he could find his way from Egypt to Greece without a single instrument. These are your ancestors' contemporaries. These are the people whose world was about to end. Rest now, and let that world settle around you. Feel its warmth, its extraordinary ordinariness, its merchants haggling over the price of tin, its scribes pressing clay, its children sleeping under the same stars you see tonight, in cities whose names we can barely pronounce, whose stones we are still digging from the ground. The world was full. The world was alive. The world was, by the standards of its time, thriving. And then something changed. Every great catastrophe has a prelude, a period of warning that is only recognizable as warning in retrospect. The Bronze Age collapse was no different. It began, most likely, with the climate. This is not speculation. It is science. Paleoclimatological research, the study of ancient climate using evidence preserved in ice cores, pollen samples, cave formations called speleothems, and tree rings, has revealed something chilling about the eastern Mediterranean between approximately 1200 and 1150 BC. The region experienced a prolonged and severe drought. Not a single bad year. Not a difficult decade. A multi-generational, civilizational scale shift in rainfall patterns that dried up rivers, killed harvests, and turned fertile soil into cracked and yielding dust. Imagine being a farmer in the Hittite heartland of Anatolia, in what is now central Turkey. Your grandfather farmed this land. Your father farmed this land. You know the rhythms of the seasons the way you know the rhythm of your own heartbeat. You plant in spring when the rains come. You harvest in autumn when the air turns gold. You store enough grain to last through the cold months. And you offer a portion to the temple. And you sleep soundly knowing the cycle will begin again. But what if the rains come late? And then lighter than expected? And then the following year, lighter still? The Hittite Royal Archives, excavated from the ancient capital of Hattusa, now Bogazkale in Turkey, and preserved in that miraculous Bronze Age way of baking in clay, contain a letter from the Hittite king to the Pharaoh of Egypt. The letter is heartbreaking in its directness. The king writes, and we have the actual words, pressed 3,000 years ago into clay. It is a matter of life and death. He is requesting grain, urgently, not as a diplomatic nicety, as a desperate plea. The Hittite Empire, one of the great superpowers of the ancient world, was running out of food. The Egyptian response was to send ships loaded with grain. We know this because the archaeological record shows exactly that, grain shipments moving from Egypt northward. But here is the terrible mathematics of a cascading system failure. Even Egypt, with the Nile's extraordinary annual flooding, which renews the soil with its black silt and makes Egyptian agriculture the most reliable in the ancient world. Even Egypt was under stress. The Nile's flood levels are recorded in ancient text, and in the Nilometer, the graduated measurement posts carved into the riverbanks. And the records from this period show irregular, insufficient floods. The engine of Egypt's food surplus was misfiring. When the granaries begin to thin, everything else follows. Tax revenues fall. Armies cannot be paid. Merchants cannot buy goods because buyers have no silver. The palace redistribution systems, the Bronze Age equivalent of a national economy, where the palace collected grain and craft goods and redistributed them to workers and soldiers and scribes, begin to seize up like a mechanism running without oil. And the people at the bottom of this pyramid, the farmers, the herders, the small craftsmen, feel it first and feel it worst. They do not write letters that survive in archives, but their bones do. Bioarchaeological analysis of skeletal remains from this period in the Eastern Mediterranean shows signs of nutritional stress. Teeth with enamel hypoplasia, the characteristic horizontal bands that form when growth is interrupted by malnutrition. Bones that show the stunted growth of bodies that did not get enough to eat during childhood. The climate was not the only cause of the collapse. Scholars are emphatic about this, but it was almost certainly the first. The slow-motion disaster that weakened every system simultaneously, that made every kingdom a little more fragile, every supply chain a little more strained, every border a little less defended, so that when the other shocks came, as they inevitably did, the whole beautiful interconnected web had already been frayed down to its last threads. Let that image settle softly in your mind. Fraying threads, a web, still holding its shape, still recognizable as the world, but thinning. Thinning. You don't need to hold on to the details. Let them settle like silt in still water. Just feel the weight of it. A world that had been built over centuries, beginning to feel the tremors of its own fragility for the very first time. And then came the people from the sea, or rather, and this is the great mystery, the enormous question mark at the heart of the Bronze Age collapse. Somebody came from the sea, or from somewhere, or from everywhere. The ancient Egyptians called them, in their hieroglyphic texts, the Sea Peoples. And for more than a century and a half of modern scholarship, that name has been simultaneously the most evocative and the most frustrating label in the entire history of archaeology. Who were they? The most dramatic ancient account of the Sea Peoples comes from the Great Temple at Medinet Habu, on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, modern Luxor. The temple was built by Ramesses III, pharaoh of Egypt around 1186 to 1155 BC, and its walls are covered in vast carved relief panels and hieroglyphic texts describing a series of massive battles. In the inscriptions, Ramesses boasts, as pharaohs invariably boast, which means we must read them with a healthy skepticism, that he defeated a vast confederation of peoples who had come, in his words, from the isles, destroying everything in their path. He lists their names: the Peleset, the Checker, the Shikalesh, the Dinyan, the Weshish, names that ancient Egyptian scribes transliterated as best they could from languages they didn't speak, capturing the sounds of strangers who spoke, perhaps, dialects of Greek, or Luwian, or some Aegean tongue we have not yet identified. The Pele set are tantalizing. Many scholars believe they may be the Philistines, the people who would later settle the coast of Canaan and give Palestine its name. The Dinyan may be related to the Danaoi, one of Homer's names for the Greeks. But here's the thing that makes the Sea Peoples so extraordinary and so frustrating. We cannot find them in their homeland. We don't know where they came from with certainty. We don't know if they were a single coherent group or a loose confederation of refugees from multiple collapsed societies. We don't know if they were aggressors or themselves victims of the very collapse they are blamed for accelerating. Because here is what the archaeology actually shows, and it is more nuanced and more heartbreaking than the triumphalist pharaonic propaganda suggests. The Sea Peoples were not simply an external invasion force that crashed into a thriving world from outside. Many scholars now believe they may have been, at least in part, products of the collapse itself. Bronze Age refugees, displaced population from the Aegean and Anatolia, people whose own cities had already fallen or were falling, who were moving across the landscape in desperation, looking for somewhere to go. Think about what that means. Imagine a chain reaction. City A in the Aegean runs out of food. Its people, desperate, begin to move. They put pressure on City B, whose own resources are already strained by drought. City B's people are pushed into motion. The wave builds. By the time it reaches the shores of Egypt, it is not an army in the traditional sense. It is something more like a migration, a vast and desperate human tide that includes soldiers and sailors. Yes, but also women and children traveling in ox carts, families with everything they own loaded onto ships, entire communities in motion because there is nowhere left to stay. The Medinet Habu reliefs actually show this. In the carved panels depicting the famous land and sea battles, you can see, if you look carefully, if you stand close enough to those 3,000-year-old walls, that among the warriors there are ox carts. And in those ox carts are women and children. These are not simply raiders. These are refugees. We do not know their individual names. We do not know what language they spoke around their fires. We do not know what they called themselves. But we know they were real, and we know they were human, and we know they were afraid. And in a world where fear travels faster than grain ships, they became part of the storm. Sleep gently with that image. Not the image of the battle. The image before the battle. A family, somewhere in the Aegean or Anatolia, loading their ox cart in the dark, taking what they can carry, leaving what they cannot, walking away from the only home they have ever known, toward a horizon that offers no promises. Just the terrible, beautiful, entirely human decision to keep moving, to survive. That decision, made by countless families in countless languages across 3,000 years ago, is part of why you exist. Let us stop here, in this one city. Let us rest in Ugarit for a moment, because Ugarit is, in many ways, the most heartbreaking of all the Bronze Age cities. Not because it was the greatest. It wasn't, by the measurements of empire. Not because its fall was the most dramatic. It may not have been. But because of what it left behind. Because of what was found in the ruins of its houses and its palace and its kills and its libraries. The letters. The last letters. Words pressed into clay by people who did not yet know they were writing the last words their civilization would ever produce. Ugarit sat on the Syrian coast near the modern city of Latakia. It was a port city, prosperous and cosmopolitan, a place where Hittites and Egyptians and Mycenaean Greeks and Cypriots and Canaanites all rubbed shoulders in the marketplace. Its scribes were trained in at least 8 different writing systems, cuneiform, hieroglyphs, and their own alphabetic script, which is one of the earliest alphabets ever devised. Ugarit's alphabet, in fact, is a direct ancestor of the Phoenician alphabet, which is itself a direct ancestor of the Greek alphabet, which is a direct ancestor of the Latin letters you are reading right now. These very letters, the shapes your eyes are following across this page, carry Ugarit's DNA. And Ugarit died. Violently. Suddenly. Around 1185 BC. The archaeological evidence is stark. The city was burned. Not metaphorically. The burn layers in the soil are thick and carbon-rich, the kind of intense heat that comes from a whole city going up at once. The destruction was so sudden and so complete that archaeologists have found, in the ruins of the houses and workshops, tools left exactly where they were being used. A bronze ingot, half-processed, in a smelter's workshop. A batch of clay tablets, still unbaked, left in a kiln that was never lit. Jars of grain and oil and wine, sealed and stored, that no one ever came back to open. And then there are the letters, found in the ruins of the palace, in the areas that had been the administrative offices. Archaeologists excavated a series of cuneiform tablets that were waiting to be sent when the city fell. They had never been dispatched. They lay there for 3,000 years, their urgent messages undelivered. One of these letters is from the king of Alashia, Cyprus, to the king of Ugarit, and it reads, in translation that still carries its ancient electricity, "The enemy ships are already here. They have set fire to my towns, and have done very great damage in the country. Did you not know that all my troops were stationed in Hutti, and all my ships in the land of Lycia? Thus, the country is abandoned to itself. May you know it. Now the 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us." 7 ships. The king of Cyprus was writing to the king of Ugarit saying, 7 ships came and caused catastrophic damage. Send help. That letter was never answered, because Ugarit itself was under attack, or already burning. Another tablet found in the ruins was a letter from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, Cyprus, written in the same desperate register. "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the Hittite country, and all my ships are in the land of Lycia? I am thus utterly alone. Utterly alone." 3,000 years ago, a king wrote those words. Alone. His armies were in someone else's war. His ships were in someone else's port, and the enemy was already at his gates. The letter was never sent because there was no longer anyone to send it. The clay tablet sat in the ruins of the palace through 32 centuries of history, through the rise and fall of Persia and Greece and Rome, through the birth of Christianity and Islam, through the Crusades and the Ottoman Empire and 2 world wars, until a French archaeologist picked it up in 1929 and read words that no human eye had seen since the day they were pressed. That is what we mean when we say history is alive. Let those words settle into you now, softly. Let them dissolve like salt in water. You don't need to hold them. Just feel, for a moment, the weight of that utterance across the centuries. Utterly alone. And then, mercifully let it go. Let it drift. You are safe. You are warm. The night is soft around you. Rest here. The Hittite Empire was, by the standards of the late Bronze Age, a colossus. It stretched from the Aegean coast of Anatolia, modern Turkey's western shores, eastward across the plateau to the borders of Assyria. It controlled the silver mines of Anatolia, the grain fields of the plateau, the cedar forests of the north. Its armies were among the most formidable of the ancient world, famously deploying war chariots in such numbers that the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC, the famous clash between Ramesses II of Egypt and the Hittite king Muwatalli II, remains the largest chariot battle in recorded history. Perhaps 5,000 chariots on that single field. It is staggering to contemplate. The Hittite capital was Hattusa, a city of remarkable sophistication set on a high, rocky plateau in north-central Anatolia, surrounded by massive walls of stone and mud brick that stretched for 6 kilometers around the settlement. Within those walls, temples, palaces, scribal schools, grain storerooms, vast archives. The Lion Gate, built of massive stone blocks with carved lion heads flanking the entrance, still stands. You can go there today and walk through it. Walk through the same gateway that Hittite kings walked through, that Hittite priests walked through, that Hittite soldiers marched through on their way to wars that shaped the ancient world. And around 1200 BC, Hattusa was burned, not conquered, not captured, and absorbed into a new empire. Burned, and then abandoned. So completely abandoned that for more than 3,000 years, no one lived there. The city went back to grass and rock in the sky. The palace roots grew over. The archives were buried. The Lion Gate stood alone on its hill, looking out over empty land, and no one passed through it. Who burned it? This is one of the great unresolved questions of Bronze Age scholarship. The Hittite written record simply stops. There is no account of a final battle, no decree from a last king, no letter describing the flames. The archives go silent the way a conversation goes silent when the power cuts out mid-sentence. The scribes were there, and then they were not, and the tablets they were writing remain unfinished. The best current scholarship suggests that the Hittite state collapsed from multiple simultaneous pressures. The drought and famine we have already described, which hit the Anatolian plateau particularly hard, internal rebellions from within the empire's subject territories, who saw the moment of weakness and seized it, pressure from Western Anatolian groups called the Kaska and others, and possibly the general dislocation of populations that was spreading across the eastern Mediterranean. The empire, which had been maintained by the centripetal force of military power and surplus grain, simply lost both at once. Without surplus to redistribute, soldiers could not be paid. Without soldiers, borders could not be held. Without borders, the empire was no longer an empire. It was just a name. The last known Hittite king is named Suppiluliuma II. He left inscriptions boasting of naval victories over Cyprus, which suggests he was fighting to the end. And then, nothing. His name disappears from the record. The dynasty that had ruled for 400 years simply ends, mid-inscription, mid-thought. There is something profound in that. Not just sad, profound. Because the Hittite state apparatus, the bureaucracy, and the military, and the scribal system that had produced those extraordinary archives, that had maintained diplomatic correspondence with Egypt and Mesopotamia for 2 centuries, that entire complex cognitive infrastructure, all that institutional knowledge, all those protocols and precedents and accumulated wisdom, it didn't just move somewhere else. It stopped. The knowledge of how to write Hittite cuneiform died with the last trained scribe. The language itself, the Hittite language, one of the oldest Indo-European languages ever recorded, went silent. It would not be rediscovered until 1915, when the Czech linguist Petr Trozny cracked the code of the Boghazkel tablets. 3,000 years of silence for a language spoken by millions. Let that sink into you gently, like rain into dry earth. The Hittites were not myths. They were people who spoke a language and loved their children and argued about grain prices and built walls that still stand. And they are gone in a way that most civilizations never quite managed to be gone. Utterly, completely, silently gone. Let that be a kind of comfort in its strange way. That even the most complete silence eventually ends. That even the most forgotten things are eventually found. That nothing, truly, is ever entirely lost. Far to the west, on the other side of the Aegean Sea, another civilization was unraveling. The Mycenaean Greeks are, in many ways, the most familiar of all the Bronze Age peoples, or at least, the most familiar by name. They are the people Homer wrote about 3 or 4 centuries after their civilization had already collapsed and dissolved in a legend. Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, the Trojan War. These names, these stories, have traveled through 3,000 years of human culture and arrived still warm in our own century, still capable of moving us, still contained in our art and our literature and our dreams. But the real Mycenaeans, the actual, historical, bronze-using, palace-building, linear-beriding Mycenaeans were different from, and in many ways more extraordinary than, Homer's heroes. They were not simply warriors. They were bureaucrats, administrators, palace economies of staggering sophistication. The palaces of Mycenaean Greece, at Mycenae itself, at Tiryns, at Pylos, at Thebes, at Orchomenos, were the centers of complex redistributive economies. And we know this because of Linear B, the script the Mycenaeans used to keep their records, which was deciphered by the brilliant amateur cryptographer Michael Ventris in 1952. Linear B turned out to be an early form of Greek, a discovery that permanently rewrote our understanding of Greek history, and the tablets written in it are almost entirely administrative. Inventories, lists, records of who owed what to whom. They record, in meticulous detail, so many jars of olive oil from such and such a district, so many bronze sword blades in the armory, so many women in the textile workshop, and what their rations are, and the names of their children. The palace at Pylos, excavated from 1939 onward, and the source of some of the most extraordinary Linear B tablets ever found, kept records of its bronze smiths, its rowers, its grain stores, its perfume oil production. The Mycenaeans were, in the most literal sense, paperwork people. They measured and recorded and cataloged the world with an almost modern intensity. And then around 1180 to 1150 BC, the palaces burned. All of them. Not one Mycenaean palace survived into the 12th century in anything like its original form. Mycenae itself shows a destruction layer, that same terrible carbon dark stripe in the soil, consistent with violent destruction by fire. Tiryns, Pylos, all burning. At Pylos, the final tablets are particularly haunting. They record, in the last weeks before the palace's destruction, frantic administrative activity, dispatching rowers to coastal defense posts, redistributing bronze from temple offerings to make weapons, a desperate and theologically fraught act, robbing the gods to arm the soldiers, sending watchmen to the coast. Something was coming from the sea. The Pylians knew it. They were preparing, and the tablets that record their preparations were baked hard, preserved perfectly, by the fire that ended their world. After the destruction, something extraordinary and melancholy happens. Linear B disappears. The script is gone. Not adapted, not simplified, gone. Greece enters what historians call the Dark Ages, a period of 3 to 4 centuries during which literacy itself, at least in the Aegean, seems to have vanished. No written records, no palace accounts, no diplomatic correspondence. The population drops dramatically, as shown by settlement surveys. Villages that have been inhabited for generations are abandoned. The sophisticated palace redistribution economy simply stops. And when Greece reemerges into literacy, it uses a completely different alphabet, borrowed from the Phoenicians, and it no longer remembers Linear B at all. The writing system of the Mycenaeans was so thoroughly lost that when Ventris cracked its code in 1952, it was the first time any living person had read it in 3,000 years. 3,000 years. Let your breathing slow now. Feel the night around you, soft and dark. The Mycenaeans are gone in the way that very few things ever managed to be completely gone. But the stories they told, the stories that became Homer's epics, survived. Fragmented, transformed, embellished beyond recognition. But surviving, which means something essential persisted. Not in writing, in mouths, in memory, in the extraordinary human insistence on passing the story forward, even when everything else falls away. Egypt did not fall. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because in a story of almost total civilizational collapse, Egypt's survival is the great anomaly, the one data point that resists the pattern, that complicates the narrative, that forces us to ask harder questions about what, exactly, causes civilizations to fail. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, battered, diminished, transformed, but surviving. The pharaonic state continued. The temples continued to be built. The hieroglyphic tradition continued to be written. The Nile continued to flood, and the farmers continued to plant, and the gods continued to receive their offerings. Egypt would endure for another 1,000 years of pharaonic civilization after the Bronze Age collapse, and in a modified form, considerably longer than that. So why Egypt? Why did the Nile Valley hold when everything else fell? Part of the answer is geography. Egypt is, in a very real sense, a fortress. The Nile Valley is surrounded on the east by the Sinai Peninsula and desert, on the west by the Sahara, and on the north by the Mediterranean. The Delta region has some agricultural vulnerability, but the heartland of Egypt, the narrow green strip of the Nile Valley from Aswan to Cairo, is one of the most defensible agricultural territories on Earth. Invaders can enter, but they can only enter through a small number of choke points. And Egypt's military had been defending those choke points for 2,000 years. Ramesses III knew this. His great battles against the Sea Peoples, the famous engagements depicted at Medinet Habu, were fought at Egypt's borders, at the mouth of a river in the Delta, on the coastal road through Sinai. He did not let the fighting come to the Nile. He went out to meet it, and by all accounts, allowing for the substantial propaganda inflation of pharaonic inscriptions, he won. Or at least, he stopped the advance. The Sea Peoples settled on Egypt's borders, in Canaan, rather than within Egypt itself. But there is a second, deeper answer to why Egypt survived, and it is one that speaks to something fundamental about the nature of resilience. Egypt was old, not just in years, in institutional depth. The pharaonic system had been operating, in some recognizable form, for 2,000 years before the Bronze Age collapse. 2,000 years of accumulated institutional knowledge. How to manage the flood, how to store grain, how to distribute food in years of shortage, how to maintain the loyalty of regional administrators. Egypt had a deep reservoir of what we might call civilizational muscle memory, the ability to respond to crisis using systems that had been refined across dozens of crises before. The Hittite Empire was 400 years old when it collapsed. Mycenaean palace civilization was perhaps 500 years old. Ugarit had been a great trading city for perhaps 300 years. Egypt had been continuously governed from Memphis or Thebes for 2,000 years. That depth of institutional experience is not nothing. It is, perhaps, everything. Ramesses III himself was not, by most accounts, a particularly great pharaoh in the mold of Ramesses II. He was not a brilliant general or a visionary administrator, but he was competent, and in the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse, competence combined with institutional depth and geographic advantage was enough. Barely enough. His reign ended in what is known as the Harem Conspiracy, an assassination plot by members of his own household, perhaps motivated by the political pressures of a kingdom under severe stress. Whether he survived the attempt is a matter of current debate. But the state survived. The institution was larger than the man. After his reign, Egypt entered a period of slow decline. Weaker pharaohs, fragmented authority, rising priestly power, diminished control over its former territories in Canaan. The new kingdom effectively ended within a century of the Bronze Age collapse. Egypt didn't fall off a cliff. It walked slowly down a slope. But it walked. It continued. Its monuments still rose. Its scribes still wrote. Its farmers still planted the black earth the Nile provided. And from that stubborn, river-fed continuity, much of Western civilization, including the traditions that influenced early Judaism, which influenced Christianity, which influenced Islam, drew its first slow breath. Rest now. Let Egypt's strange persistence settle over you like the warmth of the afternoon Sahara sun on old stone. Not everything that was beautiful was lost. Some things held. Some things survived. And from the surviving things, new worlds eventually grew. We need to stop here and think carefully about something. Because the Bronze Age collapse is not just a story about individual kingdoms falling. It is a story about a system failing. And understanding why the system failed is, perhaps, the most urgent and the most contemporary lesson this ancient catastrophe has to offer. The Bronze Age world was, as we have established, deeply interconnected. This interconnectedness was its great strength. The same trade routes that brought copper from Cyprus, and tin from Afghanistan, and grain from Egypt also brought ideas, technologies, languages, and cultural innovations. The Ulubrian ship was not just carrying metal. It was carrying the physical manifestation of a world where no single region needed to be self-sufficient, because the system as a whole provided what each part needed. But interconnectedness is a double-edged tool. The same networks that allow prosperity to spread also allow failure to spread. When one node in the network comes under stress, it transmits that stress along its connections to every other node. And if enough nodes come under stress simultaneously, the network doesn't just weaken, it collapses. This is what the economist and complexity theorist Eric Klein has called a perfect storm scenario. Not one cause, not even two or three causes, but a whole constellation of stressors arriving simultaneously in a system that was already operating at maximum capacity. The drought, the famines, the internal rebellions, the sea people's migrations, the disruption of trade routes, the breakdown of diplomatic networks. Each one of these, in isolation, might have been survivable. The history of the Bronze Age is full of individual kingdoms surviving individual crises, but all of them at once, cascading through a system whose very interconnectedness meant that failure could propagate faster than response could organize. That was something the system had never been tested against before. Think of it as a kind of fragility paradox. The very features that made the Bronze Age world sophisticated and prosperous, the specialization, the interdependence, the long supply chains, the complex administrative systems, also made it catastrophically vulnerable to systemic shocks. Cyprus produced copper, but grew limited food. Greece produced grain and pottery, but had no tin. Egypt had grain in abundance, but needed Anatolian silver and Levantine cedar. Each kingdom had become so specialized, so dependent on the functioning of the whole, that when the whole began to stutter, none of them had the local resilience to sustain themselves independently. Ugarit is the perfect example. When the Sea Peoples attacked, the king wrote desperately to Cyprus and Egypt for help, but his armies were stationed in Anatolia, fighting someone else's war. His navy was in Lycia, serving someone else's fleet. He had contributed his military resources to the shared defense of the system, and when he needed them back, the system could not return them in time. He was, as he wrote himself, utterly alone. The Bronze Age collapse destroyed not just buildings and cities. It destroyed the knowledge systems that maintained those cities. The linear B scribes who kept the palace accounts of Mycenae. They were specialists, trained from childhood in a complex and demanding skill. When the palaces burned, those scribes died or dispersed. Their knowledge died with them, because there was no context outside the palace system in which that knowledge had any use or meaning. The same was true of the Hittite diplomatic scribes, the Ugaritic merchants who knew the trade routes and the exchange rates and the names of the right person to contact in a dozen different ports. All that accumulated, experiential, irreplaceable human knowledge, gone. What survived was simpler, more robust, less dependent on the system. The Phoenicians, who would carry civilization's next chapter forward, were not palace economy people. They were traders, yes, but small-scale, flexible, adaptable traders who could operate from a single ship, rather than requiring a whole empire's infrastructure to function. The early Israelites, who crystallized as a distinct cultural entity in the wake of the collapse, had a portable religious system centered on a text and a covenant rather than a temple and a redistribution palace. Adaptability, portability, robustness over efficiency. These were the evolutionary survivors of the Bronze Age collapse. There is something in this that speaks very quietly to our own moment. We live in a world of extraordinary interconnectedness, of supply chains that span continents, of systems so complex and interdependent that their failure modes are genuinely difficult to anticipate. The Bronze Age collapse does not tell us that our world will collapse. History is not a template. But it does remind us, very gently from the depth of 3,000 years, that systems which are optimized for efficiency at the expense of resilience are always operating at a kind of risk that doesn't show up in the ordinary accounts. Let that thought move through you now, and then let it go. You don't need to carry it. Just notice it, the way you might notice a scent on the wind. Interesting, worth a moment's attention, and then passing through. The night is here. The dark is soft. You are safe. Rest. Let us turn now from the palaces and the politics and the dramatic last letters and descend into something quieter, more intimate, more absolute. Let us turn to what the bones say. Because when the written records stop, when the tablets are burned and the scribes are dead and the diplomatic archives fall silent, the bones continue to hold their testimony. And modern science has become extraordinarily good at reading it. Isotopic analysis. Ancient DNA. Strontium ratios locked in tooth enamel. These are the tools that have transformed Bronze Age archaeology in the last 2 decades, allowing us to ask questions that no previous generation of scholars could even formulate. Not just what happened to these cities, but what happened to these people. Where did they go? Who did they become? What is the genetic legacy of the Bronze Age collapse in the DNA of people alive today? The answers are beginning to emerge, and they are extraordinary. Strontium isotope analysis works by exploiting the fact that different geological formations have different strontium isotope ratios, and that these ratios are incorporated into tooth enamel during childhood. By analyzing the strontium in ancient teeth, we can determine where a person grew up. And in sites associated with the Bronze Age collapse, destroyed cities, refugee settlements, transitional communities, we are finding something remarkable. Populations that were born somewhere else. People whose teeth were formed in one geological region, but whose bodies were buried in another. Migrants. Refugees. People in motion. At the site of Tel Megiddo, in Israel, analysis of skeletons from the destruction period shows individuals with strontium signatures indicating they grew up in Greece or Anatolia. At coastal sites in Cyprus, we find people who grew up in the Levant. The mobility that the Bronze Age collapse triggered, the migrations of refugees and displaced populations that ancient Egyptian texts describe as the Sea Peoples, is written in the chemistry of people's bones, confirming what the text suggests. This was not just a military event. It was a massive human movement. Ancient DNA studies are telling an even richer story. Researchers working on Bronze Age Aegean DNA have found that the genetic landscape of Greece changes noticeably between the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, the period immediately after the collapse. New genetic signatures appear in the post-collapse population that are associated with ancestry from Anatolia and the wider Eastern Mediterranean. The collapse was not just a political event. It was a mixing event, a genetic mixing event that restructured the populations of the Eastern Mediterranean in ways that are still visible, faintly, in the DNA of people living in those regions today. And here's where it becomes deeply personal for you. If you have any ancestry from the Eastern Mediterranean, Greek, Turkish, Levantine, Egyptian, Italian, Spanish, even French or British ancestry that goes back far enough, then the Bronze Age collapse is not ancient history in your DNA. It is recent history. The population movements triggered by the collapse of 1177 BC, the mixing of Bronze Age Greeks and Anatolians and Levantines and Aegean Islanders, contributed to the genetic composition of populations whose descendants eventually spread across Europe and the world. You are in a measurable, scientific, non-metaphorical sense a product of that collapse. The refugees who loaded their ox carts in the dark and walked away from burning cities, their choices, their survivals, their unions with strangers in new lands. All of that is encoded in the molecular architecture of your cells. The collapse that ended a world also seeded the next one. And the next one produced ours. And ours produced you. This is the great wonder at the heart of the Bronze Age story. Not just the tragedy, though it is genuinely tragic, but the continuity, the persistence, the extraordinary, stubborn, molecular insistence of life on carrying the story forward. Even through the fire, even through the dark, even through the centuries of silence. Feel that now, not as a thought, but as a physical sensation. The warmth of your own body, the weight of your own existence. 3,000 years of continuous human survival, encoded in every cell, resting now in the soft dark of this night. There is a term, the Greek Dark Ages, that has haunted Bronze Age scholarship for decades. It refers to the period from approximately 1100 to 800 BC, the 3 centuries after the Bronze Age collapse, during which the Eastern Mediterranean, and Greece especially, appears to have experienced a dramatic reduction in population, a loss of literacy, a contraction of trade, and a general retreat from the sophistication of the Bronze Age world. The term is not inaccurate, exactly, but it is incomplete. And completeness matters here, because what happened in the Dark Ages is not simply a story of loss. It is also, and perhaps more importantly, a story of survival, of transformation, and of the extraordinary human capacity to carry essential things forward through terrible darkness. Let us begin with what we know is lost. The palace economies, the linear B writing system, the long-distance tin and copper trade networks, the complex diplomatic protocols of the Bronze Age. These things did not survive. The world of 1000 BC in Greece was materially simpler than the world of 1300 BC. Fewer people, smaller settlements, handmade rather than wheel-thrown pottery, iron replacing bronze. Not because iron is obviously superior. It isn't. Initially, early iron is actually inferior to good bronze, but because the copper-tin supply chains that produced bronze had collapsed, and iron, which can be found and worked almost everywhere, was available. But now let us speak of what survived. And what survived is, in some ways, more important than what was lost. The story survived. In the absence of writing, in the absence of palace scribes and diplomatic archives, the memories of the Bronze Age were entrusted to something older and more robust than clay tablets, the human mouth. The tradition of oral poetry, the bardic tradition, in which trained singers memorized and performed and improvised elaborate narrative poems about the heroes and events of the Bronze Age, carried forward the essential cultural memory of a world that no longer materially existed. The Iliad and the Odyssey, which most scholars date to the 8th century BC in their written form, are the products of this process. They are not history in the modern sense. They are not documentary accounts of actual events. They are the distilled residue of 3 or 4 centuries of oral tradition, of bards sitting in the courts of small, struggling post-Bronze Age Greek chieftains, performing tales of the great heroes of the past, tales that have been told and retold and refined and embellished through generation after generation of darkness. They carry, encoded in their formulas and epithets and story patterns, faint memories of the Bronze Age world. The bronze weapons, when iron was already the contemporary standard. The ship catalogs that may preserve actual memories of Mycenaean fleets. The great palaces and treasure hoards that had not existed for centuries. This is one of the most extraordinary facts in all of human cultural history, that the primary literary monuments of Western civilization, the works from which so much of European literature, philosophy, and self-understanding flows, are the products of a dark age. They are songs that people sang to remember a world that had been lost. They are, in the deepest sense, the artistic response to catastrophe. Beauty, forged in the forge of collapse. But the survival was not only cultural. It was biological. People survived the Bronze Age collapse. not in the comfortable numbers of the Bronze Age peak, not in the sophisticated palace cities, but in the villages, in the hills, in the small farming communities that had always existed beneath the level of the palace economies, largely invisible in the archaeological record because they didn't generate impressive ruins, but present nonetheless. These people kept farming. They kept shepherding their animals. They kept marrying and having children and passing on the accumulated knowledge of how to work the land, how to read the seasons, how to preserve food and heal wounds and navigate by stars. They were the root system. The palace was the flower, brilliant, visible, beautiful, and ultimately ephemeral. But underneath it, the root system persisted. And from those roots, slowly, over the centuries, the next world grew. You are reading this tonight because of those root system people. The ones who didn't make it into the archives. The ones who didn't write letters that survived in clay. The ones who just kept going in the hills and the valleys and the small communities through the dark. Let that be the image you carry into sleep. Not the burning palace, not the broken tablet, but the root system, patient and invisible, holding life in the earth, waiting for the spring that will inevitably come. Out of the wreckage, something new. History does not stop. Even after the most comprehensive collapse, the human capacity for reorganization, for finding new solutions to persistent problems, for building something from the materials that remain, this capacity does not stop. It may slow, it may shrink, but it doesn't stop. The Phoenicians are perhaps the greatest proof of this. They emerged as a recognizable cultural and commercial force from the Lebanese coast in the aftermath of the Bronze Age collapse, from cities like Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, which had survived the collapse in diminished form and were now, slowly, rebuilding their connections to the world. The Bronze Age trading network had shattered. The Mycenaean customers were gone. The Hittite customers were gone. Egypt was weakened and internally preoccupied. The whole customer base had collapsed. The Phoenicians rebuilt it, not in the same form, not as a palace-centered redistribution economy, not as an elaborate diplomatic network of royal correspondence, but as something leaner, more flexible, more entrepreneurial. They were merchants first, in a way that Bronze Age traders, who operated largely as extensions of palace economies, had not been. They took risks on their own account. They found new markets. They sailed further. The Phoenicians carried the Mediterranean trade further west than it had ever gone before. Their ships reached Sardinia, and then the North African coast, and then southern Spain. They founded colonies. Carthage, founded around 814 BC, which would one day field a general named Hannibal who would bring Rome to its knees. They sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, into the Atlantic Ocean itself. Ancient sources claim they circumnavigated Africa, a journey that would not be accomplished by European ships again until the Portuguese at the end of the 15th century AD. But the Phoenicians' greatest gift to the world was not their ships or their purple dye, though the purple dye, extracted from the murex sea snail in a process so labor-intensive that it was worth its weight in silver, made them rich and gave their name to the color of royalty across the ancient world. Their greatest gift was the alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet, 22 consonantal letters, capable of representing any language phonemically, simple enough to be learned in weeks rather than the years of training required for cuneiform or hieroglyphics, was borrowed by the Greeks, adapted with vowels added, and became the Greek alphabet. The Greek alphabet, in turn, became the Latin alphabet, which is the foundation of every Western language writing system in use today. The letters you are reading right now, each one, descends from Phoenician originals, which themselves descend from the Proto-Semitic script developed by Semitic-speaking workers in Egyptian turquoise mines around 1900 BC. Your ABCs are 3,500 years old. The letter A is a Phoenician ox head, turned upside down. The letter B is a house. The Phoenician word Bet, which is also the Hebrew word for house. The letter O is an I. You are reading a language of ancient agricultural imagery, distilled into 26 shapes, carried forward through every civilization that has risen since the Bronze Age collapse. This is what I mean when I say that the collapse was also a dispersal, a seed pod bursting. The Bronze Age world was, in some respects, too concentrated, too dependent on palace centers, on centralized knowledge, on complexity that required vast infrastructure to maintain. The collapse broke that concentration open, scattered the seeds. And some of those seeds, the alphabet, the stories, the olive trees, the root system people in their hill villages, landed in new soil and grew into something the Bronze Age world, for all its extraordinary sophistication, had never produced. The possibility of a world in which any person could learn to read and write in a matter of weeks. You are reading words tonight because of Phoenician sailors, because of the Bronze Age collapse that pushed them west, because of the centuries of darkness that forced a simpler, more portable, more democratic writing system into being. Let that extraordinary chain of consequence settle into you now, like the warmth of a lamp. The world that made your literacy possible was born in catastrophe, and it is beautiful. We have traveled a long way tonight, through the great interconnected Bronze Age world, through its trembling and its fracture and its fall, through the dark centuries and the slow, extraordinary renewal. We have walked through burning Ugarit and silent Hattusa, sailed with Phoenician merchants, and stood with Egyptian farmers at the edge of a low Nile. And now, in the spirit of intellectual honesty that this story deserves, we should slow even further and admit something that is not a weakness, but a kind of wonder. We still don't really know what caused the Bronze Age collapse. Or more precisely, we have compelling evidence for several contributing factors, and we cannot determine with certainty their relative weights or the precise sequence of their interactions. This is not a failure of scholarship. It is a reflection of the irreducible complexity of history. When multiple causes interact through a complex system over several generations, the idea of a single explanation is not just wrong. It is a category error. Life is not that simple. History is not that simple. The drought hypothesis is strong. Paleoclimatological data from multiple independent proxies, pollen cores from lake sediments, speleothem records from Sorek Cave in Israel, grain pollen data from Anatolia, organic carbon records from seafloor sediments, consistently show a drying event in the eastern Mediterranean centered on the 12th century BC. The signal is real. The drought happened, but drought alone has never definitively destroyed a civilization. Egypt survived. Mesopotamia survived in attenuated form. The question of why the drought was fatal in some places and survivable in others requires additional explanation. The Sea Peoples hypothesis is also real, but also partial. People moved. Cities were attacked and burned. The Egyptian records document this unambiguously. But the Sea Peoples were not operating in a vacuum. They were, in many cases, themselves products of earlier disruptions in the Aegean and Anatolia. They were a symptom as much as a cause. And not every site that shows destruction in this period can be convincingly attributed to Sea Peoples' activity. Some destructions were internal. Some may have been earthquakes. Some may have been the local armed response to economic breakdown. The earthquake hypothesis has had its moments of scholarly fashion. The archaeologist Robert Drews argued that a major shift in military technology, from the chariot-dominated warfare of the Bronze Age to infantry-based tactics using slashing swords, was the key factor, as the new infantry tactics made the palace elite military systems obsolete. Eric Klein, in his landmark 2014 book, 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, argues most persuasively for what he calls a perfect storm, a convergence of stressors that individually might have been managed, but collectively overwhelmed the system's resilience. And then there is the possibility that we are missing evidence. Most of what we know about the Bronze Age collapse comes from the archaeological record and from the surviving texts of literate societies, Egypt primarily, and the Hittites and Ugaritans to a lesser extent. We know almost nothing from the perspective of the populations that were doing the destroying, or migrating, or transforming. The Sea Peoples left no archives. The communities that survived in the hills and the islands and the margins left no palace records. The voices of the majority of the people who lived through the collapse are entirely absent from the evidence. This absence is its own kind of testimony. The Bronze Age collapse was not just a collapse of kingdoms. It was a collapse of the record-keeping systems that preserve the voices of the past. And when the record-keeping systems stop, what we get is silence. A silence that is not the absence of human life, but the absence of human documentation. Those people were still there. They were still living, still speaking, still thinking, still feeling. We just cannot hear them. This is perhaps the most profound lesson the Bronze Age collapse teaches about the nature of history itself. That what we call history is always only a fragment of what actually happened, preserved by accident and the survival of archive-keeping systems, and that the vast majority of human experience has been lived in silence and is lost to us, not because it was less real, not because it was less important, but because no one pressed a clay tablet. Rest with the mystery. Let it be comfortable rather than troubling. Not all questions need answers tonight. The ancient world is patient. It has already waited 3,000 years. It can wait a little longer while you sleep. The world that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse, slowly, over the course of the 11th and 10th and 9th centuries BC, was not simply a lesser version of what had come before. It was something genuinely new. Something that the Bronze Age world, for all its sophistication and interconnectedness and achievement, had never managed to produce. It was, in the fullest sense, a different kind of civilization. The Bronze Age world had been, at its core, a palace world. A world organized around centralized redistribution economies controlled by small elites who accumulated resources and doled them out to specialists, scribes, soldiers, artisans, merchants, in exchange for their labor and loyalty. The complexity of the Bronze Age was, in a very real sense, top-down. The palace made the world work, and without the palace, the world didn't work. The Iron Age world that emerged after the collapse was, by contrast, more horizontally organized. The new technologies, iron metallurgy, the Phoenician alphabet, more efficient agricultural tools, were not palace monopolies. Iron ore is common. It can be found and smelted in most regions. The tools made from it were available to farmers, not just palace workshops. The alphabet could be learned by anyone, a merchant, a scribe, a sailor, in weeks rather than years of specialized training. The new world was, structurally, more democratic than the old one. And from this more democratic technological and cultural substrate emerged some of the most consequential intellectual and spiritual developments in human history. The Israelite tradition, or more precisely, the complex process by which diverse Semitic-speaking communities in Canaan developed. During the Iron Age, a distinctive monotheistic religious culture crystallized in the period immediately following the Bronze Age collapse. The Hebrew Bible's oldest texts, including the Song of Deborah and the Book of Judges and portions of the Book of Amos, date to the early Iron Age. The experience of the collapse and its aftermath, the destruction of cities, the migration of populations, the breakdown of palace economies and their gods, seems to have been one of the conditions that made radical religious innovation possible. When the gods of the palaces fail along with the palaces, new theological possibilities open up. The Greeks, after their Dark Age, emerged into the classical period with a cultural energy that remains, 3,000 years later, almost impossible to fully account for. Philosophy, drama, democracy, the scientific method. The great Greek intellectual revolution of the 6th and 5th centuries BC, Thales, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, cannot be entirely explained by the Bronze Age collapse. But the collapse and its aftermath created conditions. The Phoenician alphabet that made literacy accessible, the loss of palace-centered authority that made intellectual independence possible, the mixing of populations that brought diverse ideas into contact, that were not unimportant preconditions for what followed. When Rome eventually rose and built its empire on Greek intellectual and Phoenician commercial foundations, it too was a child of the collapse, however indirectly. The Latin alphabet that preserved Roman law and literature and eventually transmitted them to medieval Europe and from there to the modern world. It descends, letter by letter, from the Phoenician sailors who emerged from the wreckage of the Bronze Age, and the Arabic numerals you use to do mathematics, and the monotheistic religious traditions that shaped 3,000 years of ethics and law and art and politics, and the stories of Homer that taught the Western world what a hero was and what an epic journey meant. All of these things have their roots, twisted and deep and largely invisible, in the soil of the Bronze Age collapse. This is the paradox that the Bronze Age collapse ultimately teaches. That catastrophe and creation are not opposites. They are, in the long record of human experience, partners. The collapse of a complex, palace-centered world created the conditions for simpler, more robust, more accessible, more portable cultural forms to emerge. And those forms, forged in the Dark Ages, eventually produced a world more widely creative, more widely literate, more widely free than the palace world had ever been. The fire that burned Ugarit was a tragedy. The silence that fell over Greece was a tragedy. The last letter of a Levantine king, never sent, is a tragedy. But what grew from that silence, the alphabet, the philosophy, the monotheism, the democracy, is among the greatest chapters in the human story. Let that be the light you carry into sleep, not the fire, the light that came after. We have come a long way together tonight, through the shining world of the late Bronze Age, with its palace scribes and its copper ingots and its diplomatic letters between kings who called each other brother, through the slow darkening, the drought that dried the grain, the famines that emptied the storerooms, the desperate refugees crossing a sea that had no mercy to offer, through the burning of Ugarit and the silencing of Hattusa, and the last Linear B tablets baked hard in the palace fires of Pilus, through Egypt's stubborn survival, and the dark centuries when the world contracted and grew quiet, and the slow, extraordinary rebuilding, the Phoenician alphabet and the Greek polis, and all the extraordinary, improbable things that grew from the wreckage. And now we are here at the end of the story, or rather, at the place in the story where the story stops being ancient and becomes present, becomes you. There is a community of people, a quiet, thoughtful, curious community, scattered across time zones and languages and cultures, who come to this kind of slow, careful exploration of the past not because they want to memorize dates and names, but because they feel instinctively that the past is not separate from them. That history is not a museum where dead things are preserved behind glass, but something more like a river, always moving, always arriving, always carrying sediment from somewhere upstream and depositing it in the present, in us. You are in that community, and we are deeply grateful for your presence in it. If this slow journey has meant something to you, if the image of the Ugarishan king's last letter, or the burned libraries of Hattusa, or the Phoenician sailors carrying the alphabet westward into an unknown sea, if any of these have settled into you and felt like something worth knowing, then perhaps you might consider becoming a supporting member of what we do here. Not because we will lock away the stories without your support. The stories belong to everyone. But because slow, careful research, the kind that sits with the archaeology and the genetics and the climate science, and tries to weave them into something that can be heard and felt and rested into, takes time and thought and love. And your support makes that possible. But that is a small thing, a whisper. What matters most right now is something else entirely. What matters is this: you are alive, which means that somewhere in the chain of survival that stretches from a Bronze Age village in the Eastern Mediterranean through the Dark Ages and the Iron Age and the Classical world and the Medieval world and all the extraordinary, terrible, beautiful centuries between then and now, somewhere in that unbroken chain, every single link held, every single ancestor, in every generation from 1177 BC to the moment you were born, survived long enough to reproduce. Against famine and plague and war and darkness and the collapse of every system they depended on, they survived. And their survival is the direct, causal, non-metaphorical reason you exist to hear this story. You are not separate from the Bronze Age collapse. You are its continuation. Your DNA is a record of every migration those ancient people undertook, every new land they settled, every stranger they loved, every hardship they endured. The Bronze Age world ended, but the people in it did not end. They transformed. They dispersed. They carried forward, in their bodies and their memories and their voices, the essential human project, the project of surviving and caring for each other and making beauty and telling stories in the dark. And here you are, at the end of a long night of stories, carrying that project forward in the simplest possible way, by resting, by allowing your body, this extraordinary biological miracle that is simultaneously very ancient and very new, to do what it needs to do, to sleep, to repair, to consolidate memory, to prepare for another day of being the improbable, irreplaceable, 300,000-year-old result of an unbroken chain of human persistence. The names can go now: Ramesses, Suppiluliuma, Ugarit, Hattusa, Pilus. Let them dissolve like salt in warm water. You don't need to hold them. They have already gone into you, deeper than memory, into whatever part of us absorbs the past and carries it without knowing. The facts can go. The dates, the trade routes, the tin-to-copper ratios, the strontium isotopes. Let them blur and soften and become something less like information and more like texture, the texture of great time, the feeling of depth beneath your feet, the sense of being held by a history that is larger than you and older than you, and, in all the ways that matter, part of you. The world that was lost gave birth to the world that replaced it, and the world that replaced it gave birth, in 10,000 incremental steps and survivals and migrations and innovations, to the world that gave birth to you. Nothing was wasted. Not the bronze ingots at the bottom of the Ulubaran wreck. Not the last letter pressed into clay in Ugarit. Not the bards who sang of lost Mycenae through the dark centuries. Not a single breath, in 3,000 years of continuous human breathing, was wasted, including yours. Right now, this one, and the one that follows it, and the one after that, slower now, deeper, the body settling into its ancient wisdom, the mind releasing its grip on the day and the story and the names and the fire, finding instead just this, the soft dark and the warmth and the knowledge, older than language, older than bronze, older than the first city that ever rose and fell, that you are safe and you are held, and the night is long, and there is nothing you need to do now but let go. Let go. The ancestors survived, and so will you. Good night.